In a world where prejudice often overshadows kindness, a simple act of helping an elderly white man with a sofa would change 13-year-old Lucas's life forever. Living on the edge of poverty with his hardworking black mother, Lucas never expected that one selfless decision would bridge racial divides and open doors he never knew existed, leading him into the mysterious world of the wealthy foster family. But as their paths intertwine and opportunities arise in their predominantly white neighborhood, one question remains. What hidden connection lies between Lucas and the Fosters that makes them so invested in his future, transcending the social barriers that too often keep people apart? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. The gentle clinking of dishes and the faint aroma of instant coffee drifted through the thin walls of their small apartment, rousing Tommy from his sleep. Even before his alarm clock showed 5:30 a.m., he knew his mother was already up, preparing for another long day. He lay there for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of their morning routine. The quiet humming of his mother's favorite song, the soft scraping of a spatula against their worn-out pan. 12-year-old Tommy pushed aside the faded blue blanket and sat up on his mattress, which lay in the corner of their shared bedroom. The morning light barely filtered through the crack in the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. His mother's bed, neatly made despite her early rising, occupied the opposite corner. Between them stood a simple wooden dresser, its paint peeling at the edges, holding their modest collection of clothes. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sarah called out as Tommy padded into their small kitchen. She stood at the counter, her waitress uniform already on, hair neatly tied back. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion, but her smile remained warm and genuine. "I made you some eggs and toast." Tommy looked around their apartment, a space that felt smaller with each passing year but was kept meticulously clean. The walls bore hairline cracks that spiderwebbed across the ceiling, and the linoleum floor was worn thin in places, but everything was spotless. A stack of carefully organized bills sat on their second-hand coffee table, their edges worn from being handled repeatedly. "Mom, you should have slept longer," Tommy said, noting how his mother's hands trembled slightly as she poured her coffee. "You got home late from the restaurant last night." Sarah ruffled his hair affectionately. "The laundromat opens at 7, honey. Mrs. Chun needs me there early for the morning rush." She glanced at her watch, a simple timepiece that had been her mother's. "I should head out soon." Tommy knew the routine by heart. His mother would work at the laundromat until 3, rush home to change, then head to the restaurant for the dinner shift. He had learned to be independent out of necessity, doing his homework alone, preparing simple meals, and keeping their small home tidy. "I've left some money for lunch on the counter," Sarah said, gathering her things. "And don't forget to lock the door, do my homework, and don't use the stove," Tommy finished with a small smile. "I know, Mom." As the day wore on, Tommy attended to his usual tasks, straightening up their apartment, completing his homework at their wobbly kitchen table, and preparing a sandwich for dinner. The silence of the empty apartment was broken only by the occasional rumble of trains passing nearby and the muffled sounds of neighbors through the thin walls. When Sarah finally returned home at 11 p.m., her feet were swollen, and her shoulders drooped with exhaustion. Tommy had waited up, as he always did, with a cup of chamomile tea ready, her favorite. "You're such a good boy," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Just as they were settling into their evening routine, a thick envelope slid under their door with a soft swoosh. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Tommy watched as his mother's face fell, her already tired features crumpling further. "What is it, Mom?" Sarah sank into their threadbare armchair, the letter clutched in her hand. "They're raising the rent again," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Starting next month, it's going up by $200. Tommy felt his stomach twist into knots. He knew they were already struggling to make ends meet. His mother's face, usually so determined to stay positive, showed real fear for the first time he could remember. "We'll figure something out," he said firmly, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Maybe I can help more on weekends? I saw they need help at the farmer's market." Sarah looked at her son, pride and worry battling in her expression. At 12 years old, he already carried more responsibility than any child should. But as she opened her mouth to protest, Tommy cut her off with a determined look. "We're a team, right?" he said, echoing the words she'd always used. Sarah pulled him close, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, baby, we're a team." As they prepared for bed that night, Tommy lay awake long after his mother's breathing had evened out into sleep. Through the crack in their curtains, he could see the city lights twinkling like distant stars. Somewhere out there, he thought, there had to be a way to make things better. He just had to find it. The weekend market buzzed with its usual energy, a kaleidoscope of colors, sounds, and smells filling the early morning air. Tommy stood behind his small fruit stand, carefully arranging the apples and oranges his mother had helped him prepare before dawn. The wooden crate he used as a makeshift table creaked under the weight of the produce, but it was sturdy enough to hold their modest inventory. "Fresh fruit. Get your fresh fruit here," Tommy called out, his voice competing with the cacophony of other vendors and the general bustle of the market. He'd learned early on that enthusiasm could make up for what their simple display lacked in presentation. A few regular customers stopped by, offering kind smiles along with their coins, and Tommy carefully tucked each dollar into the worn leather pouch his mother had given him. The morning crawled by, the sun climbing higher in the sky, beating down on the market's canvas awnings. Tommy had just finished helping an elderly woman select the ripest oranges when he noticed something unusual across the street. An elderly man, well-dressed but clearly struggling, was attempting to maneuver an enormous pink sofa through a narrow doorway. The man's face was flushed with effort, and Tommy could see him muttering under his breath as the sofa refused to budge. Without thinking twice, Tommy called out to the vendor next to him, "Mrs. Rodriguez, could you watch my stand for a minute?" The kind-faced woman nodded, and Tommy jogged across the street, approaching the elderly man who was now leaning against the stubborn piece of furniture, catching his breath. "Excuse me, sir, would you like some help with that?" Tommy asked, already positioning himself at the other end of the sofa. The man looked up, surprise evident in his weathered features. He studied Tommy for a moment, his gray eyes sharp despite his apparent exhaustion. "Are you sure, young man? It's quite heavy." Tommy nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "I'm stronger than I look, sir. My mom says I get it from my dad." The old man's face softened at that, and he nodded. "Well then, I'd be grateful for the assistance. I'm Mr. Harrison, and this troublesome piece of furniture needs to go through that door and into the living room." Together, they lifted the sofa. Tommy could feel the strain in his arms, but he'd carried heavier loads at the market. They maneuvered carefully, Tommy backing up slowly while Mr. Harrison guided from the front. With some careful angling and a bit of creative problem-solving, they managed to get the sofa through the doorway and into the modest living room. "There we go," Tommy said, helping to position the sofa against the wall. "Perfect fit." Mr. Harrison was still catching his breath, but his eyes twinkled with appreciation. "Thank you, young man. You've saved this old fool from a very uncomfortable situation." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. "Please, let me give you something for your trouble." Tommy held up his hands, backing away slightly. "No, sir, really. I just wanted to help. My stand's right across the street, and I couldn't watch you struggle with that by yourself." What neither of them noticed was the tall figure watching from a sleek black car parked down the street. James Harrison observed the interaction through the tinted windows, his expression thoughtful. "Sir," his driver spoke up, "isn't that your father?" "Should I?" James held up a hand, silencing the driver. "Wait, I want to see this." They watched as Tommy continued to refuse payment, his body language genuine and unassuming. Mr. Harrison finally tucked his wallet away, but not before asking Tommy's name and where he could find him at the market. "That's interesting," James murmured, more to himself than the driver. "Do you know who my father was before he retired, Marcus?" The driver nodded. "Yes, sir. Chairman of Harrison Global Enterprises for 30 years. Built it from the ground up." James smiled slightly, watching as Tommy jogged back across the street to his fruit stand. And yet that young man had no idea. He helped simply because he saw someone in need. He paused, his expression becoming more determined. "Find out everything you can about that boy and his family. Something tells me we've just witnessed something rather special." Back at his stand, Tommy resumed his sales, unaware of the attention he'd attracted. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled knowingly at him. "You're a good boy, Tommy. Just like your mother raised you to be." Tommy blushed slightly, arranging his remaining fruit. It was nothing, really. He just needed help. As the day wore on and the market began to wind down, Tommy counted his earnings carefully. It wasn't much, but combined with what his mother made at her jobs, it might be enough to keep them afloat for another week. He packed up his empty crates, his arms tired but his heart lighter knowing he'd helped someone today. What he didn't know was that his simple act of kindness had set something much bigger in motion. In his office across town, James Harrison was already reading through a preliminary report about Tommy and his mother, his father's words echoing in his mind. "That boy helped me without wanting anything in return, James. When was the last time you saw something like that?" The sun was setting as Tommy walked home, his empty basket under his arm, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness, and Tommy's chance encounter with Mr. Harrison was about to prove just that. The knock on their apartment door came just as Sarah was preparing for her evening shift at the restaurant. Tommy watched as his mother hesitated, smoothing her uniform before opening the door. On their doorstep stood a tall, well-dressed man in his early 40s, his presence seeming almost too large for their modest hallway. "Mrs. Walker?" "I'm James Harrison," he said, his voice warm but professional. "May I come in? I'd like to discuss an opportunity regarding your son, Tommy." Sarah's protective instincts immediately surfaced. "Regarding Tommy?" She glanced at her son, who was watching the exchange with curiosity. "I'm sorry, but I'm about to leave for work and Please, just 5 minutes of your time," James said, producing a business card. "My father is Edward Harrison, the man Tommy helped at the market last weekend." Sarah's eyes widened slightly as she recognized the Harrison name. She stepped aside, allowing James to enter their small living room. Tommy noticed how James's expensive suit contrasted sharply with their worn furniture, but the man seemed completely at ease as he sat down. "Tommy made quite an impression on my father," James began, his eyes kind. "We'd like to offer him a job helping around my father's house on weekends. Nothing strenuous, just organizing, some light yard work, keeping an elderly man company." Sarah's brow furrowed with concern. "That's very kind. But Tommy is only 12 and Mom," Tommy interrupted gently, "I want to help. We could use the extra money, especially with the rent increase." James watched this exchange carefully before adding, "We'll provide transportation, and Tommy will be well compensated. My father's house is only 15 minutes away, and you're welcome to visit any time to see the arrangement for yourself." After much discussion and Sarah calling in a favor to switch her shift, It was agreed that Tommy would start that Saturday. The following morning, a sleek black car pulled up outside their apartment building, drawing curious glances from neighbors. Tommy's first glimpse of the Harrison estate left him speechless. The car passed through wrought iron gates and wound up a tree-lined driveway to reveal a magnificent Victorian mansion. Gardens stretched in every direction, and a fountain bubbled cheerfully in the circular drive. "Welcome, Tommy," Mr. Harrison greeted him at the door, looking much more at home than he had struggling with the sofa. Come in, come in." Tommy stepped into an entrance hall larger than his entire apartment. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and rich carpets muffled his footsteps. But what caught his attention wasn't the grandeur. It was the warmth in Mr. Harrison's eyes. "First things first," the older man said, leading Tommy to a sunny kitchen where a plate of cookies and milk awaited. "A growing boy needs proper fuel for work." As they shared the snack, Mr. Harrison began telling stories about his life. He spoke of starting his company with just a small loan and a big dream, of working long hours while raising James alone after his wife passed away. Tommy listened, fascinated by how this elegant mansion's owner had once been as poor as he was. "You remind me of myself at your age," Mr. Harrison said softly. "That same determination in your eyes." The day passed quickly as Tommy helped organize old photographs, tended to the garden, and listened to more of Mr. Harrison's stories. Before he knew it, the sun was setting, and it was time to go home. As the car pulled away, Tommy clutched an envelope containing his first day's pay, more money than he'd ever earned at the market. But somehow, the money seemed less important than the feeling he'd gotten while working alongside Mr. Harrison. When he arrived home, Sarah was waiting anxiously. "How was it, honey? Were they kind to you? Did you?" Tommy hugged his mother tightly. "It was amazing, Mom. Mr. Harrison, he's not just rich, he's nice. Really nice. And guess what? He started out poor, just like us." Sarah studied her son's face, seeing the excitement there, the hope that had been missing lately. She pulled him close, kissing the top of his head. "I'm proud of you, Tommy. So proud." That night, as Tommy lay in bed, he couldn't stop smiling. The mansion had been impressive, yes, but what really stuck with him was Mr. Harrison's kindness, his stories, the way he treated Tommy like an equal rather than just a kid. For the first time in a long while, Tommy felt something he hadn't dared feel in ages: possibility. Little did he know, in another part of town, Mr. Harrison was sitting in his study, looking at an old photograph of himself at Tommy's age, a thoughtful smile playing on his lips. Sometimes the right person comes into your life at exactly the right moment, and both Mr. Harrison and Tommy were about to discover just how true that could be. The attic of the Harrison mansion held secrets in its shadows. Tommy stood at the top of the creaky stairs, dust motes dancing in the beam of sunlight that filtered through a small round window. Mr. Harrison's silhouette moved ahead of him, a quiet guardian leading the way through years of memories. "This room, Mr. Harrison said, his voice catching slightly, "hasn't been touched since Margaret passed. My wife. She knew where everything belonged up here." They worked methodically through the morning, sorting items into piles. Tommy's movements were careful, respectful, as if he understood that each object held a story. When the leather-bound album slipped from beneath a heavy box, the thud seemed to echo through the quiet space. Mr. Harrison's breath hitched. "Oh, I'd forgotten about that one." Inside, photographs told the story of a younger Mr. Harrison and a beautiful woman with kind eyes. They sat together on an old chair, Mr. Harrison's fingers trembling slightly as he turned the pages. "We started with nothing," he said softly, "just like you and your mother. Margaret worked 2 jobs to help me start the business. She never lost her humility, even after success found us." Unknown to them both, James Harrison stood in the doorway, watching his father share these precious memories. It had been years since he'd seen such openness in the older man's face. During lunch, Tommy pulled out his school books, determined to keep up with his studies. James observed from his study as the boy worked through math problems, occasionally asking Mr. Harrison for help. "He's quite remarkable," Mrs. Reynolds, the elderly housekeeper, commented as she brought James his tea. "Reminds me of young Master Michael in many ways." Later, as Tommy helped organize the library, voices drifted from the adjacent study. "It's been 5 years, James," Mr. Harrison was saying. "You can't keep blaming yourself for Michael's accident. He was my son, Dad. My responsibility. If I hadn't been so focused on the company." Tommy froze, a book heavy in his hands. He hadn't known about James's son, hadn't realized the weight of loss that hung in these grand halls. That evening, as Tommy carefully placed Mrs. Harrison's album on its new shelf, Mr. Harrison appeared in the doorway. "You know, Tommy," he said quietly, "sometimes the greatest treasures we find aren't things at all. They're moments, memories, and sometimes second chances." As the car drove him home that night, Tommy watched the mansion disappear in the gathering dusk. In his pocket, he felt the edge of a photograph he'd found fallen from the album, one he hadn't shown Mr. Harrison. It showed a teenage boy who looked remarkably like himself, standing beside James. On the back was written, "Michael's last summer, 1999. Tommy's fingers traced the words, wondering what story lay hidden in those simple words, and why fate had brought him to this family that seemed to see in him echoes of someone they'd lost. The letter arrived like a thunderbolt on a clear day. Sarah's hands trembled as she read it, her morning coffee growing cold and forgotten. The laundromat's closure notice was printed on crisp letterhead, its corporate language doing nothing to soften the blow. All employees terminated by month's end. Tommy found his mother still at the kitchen table when he returned from school, her eyes red-rimmed and distant. Before he could speak, an envelope slid under their door with a whisper that seemed too quiet for the devastation it contained, the eviction notice. "Mom." Tommy's voice cracked as he watched his mother's shoulders begin to shake. Sarah collapsed into her chair, her usual strength crumbling. "I failed you, Tommy. All these years trying to give you a better life, and now..." Her voice broke. "Everything we've worked for." "No, Mom," Tommy said firmly, wrapping his arms around her. "You haven't failed. We're a team, remember? We'll figure this out." That weekend at the Harrison mansion, Tommy attacked his tasks with fierce determination. He arrived before sunrise, his face set with a determination that didn't match his 12 years. Mr. Harrison watched from his study window as the boy meticulously tended the gardens, organized the library, and helped Mrs. Reynolds with tasks she hadn't even asked for. During lunch break, Tommy slipped into the garden to make a phone call, unaware that Mr. Harrison was pruning roses nearby. "Mom, please don't cry," Tommy's voice carried in the quiet air. "I'll ask for more hours here. Maybe I can find another market for Sundays too. We'll make it work somehow." Mr. Harrison's pruning shears paused mid-cut, his heart heavy with the weight of the boy's burden. Later that afternoon, James arrived for his weekly visit. As he passed through the kitchen, a background check report caught his eye, specifically the photo of Sarah Walker. Something stirred in his memory. "Dad," James called out, entering the study. "Tommy's mother. She worked at Metro Children's Hospital 5 years ago, didn't she?" Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses, studying the photo. "The pediatric ward, if I'm not mistaken." "She was there that night," James said quietly, his face paling. "The night we lost Michael. She was the nurse who..." His voice trailed off as the memory crashed over him. Mr. Harrison watched understanding dawn on his son's face. "Life has a strange way of bringing people back into our paths." "She never mentioned it," James said. moving to the window where Tommy could be seen working in the garden. All these weeks, and she never said a word. "They're being evicted," Mr. Harrison said softly. "Sarah lost her job at the laundromat. The boy's working himself to exhaustion, trying to help." James stood silent for a long moment, watching Tommy. The boy's determined movements reminded him so much of Michael, the same age, the same fierce desire to make things right. As the sun set that evening, James pulled out his phone and dialed the number, his hands slightly shaking. "Dad, remember that nurse from the hospital? The one who stayed with us that night? I think it's time we repaid an old debt." In the growing darkness, Tommy headed home, unaware that his simple act of helping an elderly man with a sofa months ago had set in motion events that would change everything. Behind him, through the mansion's windows, father and son sat in the study, their heads bent together as they formed a plan that would bridge past and present, loss and hope, in ways none of them could have imagined. The photograph of Michael seemed to watch from its place on the desk, his frozen smile holding secrets yet to be revealed. The following Saturday morning, instead of starting his usual tasks, Tommy found himself seated in Mr. Harrison's study. James was there too, his usual businesslike demeanor softened by something Tommy couldn't quite identify. The room felt heavy with unspoken words. "Tommy," James began, his voice gentle, "there's something I need to tell you about your mother." He paused, collecting his thoughts. 5 years ago, my son Michael was in a car accident. He was brought to Metro Children's Hospital, and that night, your mother was the nurse on duty. Tommy's eyes widened. His mother had never mentioned this. "She stayed with me long after her shift ended," James continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She held my hand when the doctors told me Michael wouldn't make it. She made sure I wasn't alone in the darkest moment of my life." Mr. Harrison moved to stand behind his son's chair, a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Your mother never mentioned this to us, Tommy. That's the kind of person she is, helping others without expecting recognition or reward." Tommy sat quietly, processing this information. "Mom never talks about her time at the children's hospital. She says some memories are too heavy to carry around." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We've learned about your current situation, the eviction notice, your mother losing her job. We want to help." "We can't accept charity," Tommy said immediately, his pride evident in his straight spine and lifted chin. Mr. Harrison leaned forward in his chair. "Tommy, let me tell you a story. When I was your age, my family lost everything in a fire. A stranger took us in, gave us shelter in his guest house until we could get back on our feet. That kindness changed the course of my life." He gestured to the grand room around them. "All of this started because someone chose to help when they didn't have to. Sometimes, accepting help isn't about charity. It's about allowing others to pass on the kindness they once received." James cleared his throat. "We have a proposal. The guest house on the estate has been empty for years. It's a proper home, with 3 bedrooms and a garden. It would be yours and your mother's, in exchange for your continued help around the estate. And," Mr. Harrison added, "the corporate wellness center at Harrison Enterprises needs a head nurse. Someone with pediatric experience would be perfect for the position." Tommy's mind raced. The offer was incredible, too incredible. But why? Just because Mom helped you that night? "No," James said softly. "Because you helped my father with a sofa when you thought he was just another elderly man who needed assistance. Because your mother stayed with a stranger on the worst night of his life. Because some people deserve good things to happen to them." Tommy stood up suddenly, walking to the window. He could see the guest house from here, a charming 2-story cottage near the rose garden. He thought about his mother's exhausted face, about the mounting bills, about the uncertainty that had been hanging over them like a storm cloud. "I need to talk to my mom about this," he said finally. "Of course," Mr. Harrison agreed. "But Tommy," "There's something else you should know." He shared a look with James before continuing. "Your mother didn't just stay with James that night. She came back to the hospital on her days off to check on him. She organized a memorial service for Michael when she learned James was too grief-stricken to do it himself. She helped create the Children's Wing's grief support program." James stood up, moving to stand beside Tommy at the window. "Your mother helped me find my way back to life, Tommy. I never got to thank her properly. Please, let us help your family now." Tommy felt tears pricking at his eyes. He thought about all the nights his mother came home exhausted, but still found energy to help him with his homework. How she never complained, even when things were at their hardest. How she always taught him that helping others was its own reward. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll talk to her about it." As Tommy left the study that day, he felt lighter somehow. Mr. Harrison and James watched him walk through the garden, both men smiling softly. "You know, Mr. Harrison said, sometimes the greatest gifts we can give are the ones that allow others to keep giving themselves." James nodded, watching Tommy disappear down the path. "Margaret would have loved this," he said quietly, thinking of his mother. "She always said the mansion was too big for just us anyway." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the estate, and somewhere in those shadows, the spirits of Margaret Harrison and Michael seemed to smile down on this unexpected family being formed through acts of kindness both past and present. The autumn breeze carried the scent of chrysanthemums across the Harrison estate as Tommy stood at his bedroom window in the guest house, adjusting his new school tie. One year had transformed not just their lives, but the very fabric of who they were. The cottage that had once stood empty now buzzed with life, its gardens merging seamlessly with Mr. Harrison's prized roses. In the corporate offices of Harrison Enterprises, Sarah had become more than just the head nurse. Her wellness programs had transformed the company's culture, bringing a human touch that employees said reminded them of a family doctor's care rather than a corporate clinic. The photographs on her desk told their story. Tommy's first day at Preston Academy, holiday dinners with the Harrisons, and a treasured black and white image of her comforting a grieving father 5 years ago. A moment that had unknowingly connected their futures. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, James reminded her, poking his head into her office. His tie matched Tommy's school colors, no coincidence, as he'd taken to mentoring the boy in ways that helped heal his own heart. That evening, both families gathered in the mansion's dining room for their traditional Friday dinner. Mrs. Reynolds had outdone herself with a feast that filled the air with mouth-watering aromas. The crystal chandelier cast warm light over the faces around the table, highlighting the bonds that had grown stronger than blood. "Tommy," Mr. Harrison said, setting down his fork with deliberate care, "I received something interesting today." He pulled out an envelope bearing the Preston Academy seal. "Your teachers seem quite impressed. Straight A's, and particular excellence in mathematics. James's tutoring appears to be paying off." Tommy straightened in his chair, but his smile held humility. The scholarship program at Preston Academy sent an invitation for next year, he announced softly. Sarah reached for her son's hand, tears glistening in her eyes. The prestigious private school had once been an impossible dream, now made real through hard work and the Harrison family's belief in second chances. "There's more," James added, sharing a meaningful look with his father. "Tommy, we've been discussing your future. How would you feel about joining our junior executive training program when you're in high school? Learning the business from the ground up, just as I did, just as—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Just as Michael was meant to do." The room grew quiet with the weight of the moment. Tommy's eyes moved to the photograph of Michael that now sat on the mantel, the same one he'd found in the album that day in the attic. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harrison stood, moving to retrieve something from his study. He returned with a framed photograph, the one of Michael that Tommy had kept secret for so long. Sometimes, the old man said softly, life gives us second chances in the most unexpected ways. Michael would have wanted his legacy to continue through someone who understands the value of kindness and hard work. Later that evening, as Tommy and Sarah walked back to their cottage under a star-filled sky, they paused to look back at the mansion. Light spilled from its windows, and they could see James and Mr. Harrison still sitting in the dining room, their heads bent together in conversation. "Do you ever think about that night?" Tommy asked his mother. "The night you stayed with James at the hospital?" Sarah squeezed her son's shoulder. "Every day. But I also think about how that moment taught me something precious, that even in our darkest hours, we have the power to help others. And sometimes, years later, that help comes back to us in ways we never could have imagined." In Mr. Harrison's study, a new photograph had joined the collection on his desk. It showed 4 people in the garden: himself, James, Tommy, and Sarah, all laughing at something beyond the camera's view. Next to it stood the older photo of Margaret and Michael, their smiles echoing across time, bridging past and present. As the stars twinkled overhead, Tommy thought about the simple act of kindness that had started it all, helping an elderly man with a sofa at the market. He'd learned that sometimes the smallest actions could lead to the biggest changes, that second chances came in unexpected ways, and that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about the connections we make through acts of kindness and understanding. The Harrison mansion stood tall against the night sky, no longer just a symbol of wealth and success, but a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of second chances, and the endless possibilities that arise when people open their hearts to help others. And somewhere, perhaps, Michael was smiling down on this unexpected family, knowing his legacy lived on in ways more meaningful than anyone could have imagined. In Tommy's pocket, his fingers brushed against the acceptance letter from Preston Academy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, under the vast canopy of stars, everything was exactly as it should be. A story of loss and hope, of endings and beginnings, woven together by the threads of kindness that connected them all.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.